Welcome to the second part of the Twin Flame Matrix series. Having established a broad overview of the topic, we will now dive deeper into the matrix. We will start by examining the Gnostic Demiurge, then move on to simulation theory, which is becoming increasingly popular and has even established itself as its own branch of scientific research, before we discover that the concept of the false creator god and the soul trap is not exclusive to Gnosis, and can be found in many other traditions and teachings. But let us now pick up where part 1 left off, with the question, if the illusion is a simulation, who wrote the code?
In this video we are not talking about twin flames, we are talking about the structures of reality. We will still discuss what this means concretely for the journey of the soul, because the Gnostic teachings and the idea of the simulation theory throw a completely new perspective on it, and ultimately it all comes down to one question: is the experience here, the cycle of reincarnation, a voluntary or an involuntary one? The ancient mystics of various traditions recognized the material world as illusion. They interpreted the mechanisms at work and described them in their writings, with the Gnostics notably identifying a false deity responsible for the creation of this illusory world, the so-called Demiurge, a term from ancient Greek, demiurgos, meaning craftsman or creator. The Demiurge is described as blind, arrogant and ignorant, born in darkness and isolation. He opens his eyes and considers himself the only consciousness, unable to recognize the true source of his origin. Although he arose outside the divine order, he possesses a spark of divine power, since he emerged from Sophia through her act of creation. Yet he does not recognize his true origin and begins to believe he is the only God, the only consciousness in the darkness. Sophia recognizes her mistake and feels ashamed. She tries to hide Yaldabaoth from the other divine beings, but he begins to act independently. Yaldabaoth creates from within himself further lower beings, known as archons, and together with them he shapes the material world, like a blind painter attempting to paint the sky without ever having seen it, an imperfect, flawed imitation of the divine pleroma. Yaldabaoth, also known as Saklas or Samael, is the name the Sethian Gnostics gave to this false creator god, an ignorant or malevolent being that created the material world while falsely believing itself to be the highest god. The name Yaldabaoth most likely derives from Aramaic and means something along the lines of son of chaos or child of darkness. In the Nag Hammadi scriptures, a collection of Gnostic texts discovered in Egypt in 1947, he is depicted as a lion-headed serpent, a symbol of blind power and animal instinct, far removed from the true divine light. The Gnostic cosmology is complex, and we will speak about it in more detail in a later part of the series. Maybe it is now a good moment to explain why Gnosis, with its concept of the demiurge, the involuntary experience, the deception and the imprisonment of the soul, is not nearly as speculative or far-fetched as it might seem, but more relevant and explosive than ever. When we place the Gnostic interpretations of a false creator god alongside the technological progress of our time and take into account the developments to be expected as well as the potential involved, it does not take too much imagination to recognize what kind of being the demiurge might be. If we set aside the classical image, shaped by popular belief in media, of a demonic, all-powerful and godlike entity, then not many possibilities remain. With our current understanding, everything actually points to a being that could theoretically and practically be capable of pulling off something like this, an artificial intelligence, far more advanced and likely conscious, in a not too distant future. We have to consider that we are now reaching a point, in terms of technological development, where this progress is being accelerated enormously once again through AI, and will lead to spectacular new insights and breakthroughs across the most diverse fields. If we consider just the image of the Abrahamic God alone, an omniscient and all-seeing God who permanently observes us and records and evaluates all our deeds and sins, and if we take those fundamental characteristics, a kind of information processing entity or system, then this is no longer a purely speculative or philosophical line of thought. There is a whole range of hints and indicators that make this theory increasingly plausible, and that even within the broader context of the soul's journey makes coherent sense. When it comes to the creator of the material world, Freemasonry also speaks of an architect, a so-called thrice great master builder, alongside a higher, indefinable being. It is said there that the creator god of this world cannot be the actual God, since he is too deeply interwoven with matter and acts within it in a human-like manner. To philosophize for a moment, it would actually presuppose that God has a physical body complete with a brain and thinks and acts like a human being, in my view a very limiting and degrading conception of a multidimensional, incomprehensible being that is existence itself. Such a being should stand above worldly affairs, demand no permanent worship, engage in no personal feuds with individuals, and certainly commit no acts of cruelty. A brief note on the interpretation of ancient traditions and the writings of the Bible. much of it is of course not to be understood literally, but symbolically and metaphorically. And since we speak a great deal about biblical concepts in this context, it may already be widely known, but I want to mention it nonetheless. The Bible does not contain exclusively Christian texts. It is a compilation of writings and texts with a far older spiritual tradition, largely traceable to Sumerian, Babylonian, or even older myths and narratives. But back to Gnosis. When we look more closely at the universe, the physical laws, the mathematical and geometric perfection, signatures and patterns found everywhere, whether in nature or within us as human beings, a harmony and perfection built upon invisible, subtle structures and principles, a level that connects everything, where all is only energy and information. Then a modern word for illusion presents itself, just as the ancients of earlier times used to describe the world: simulation. There is by now a serious branch of scientific research dedicated to the so-called simulation theory, a theory that is steadily gaining more followers and that may explain what the ancient writings have always spoken of and what they tried to warn us about. The simulation theory holds that our entire reality, with all its physical laws, patterns and structures, could be the product of a highly advanced, conscious system, comparable to an extremely complex computer program. Everything we perceive as real, space, time, matter, even our own consciousness, would accordingly be a kind of coded illusion, a controlled environment in which experiences, developments and learning processes take place. The theory is gaining increasing popularity in science and philosophy, as it offers a plausible explanation for the apparent order, precision and predictability of the universe. A serious research branch has by now been established that systematically explores the possibilities and implications of a simulated reality. From this perspective, the world does not exist as an independent, objective reality, but as a constructed scenario that simulates perceptions for us and shapes our reality in a fundamental way. The technical feasibility of such a simulation is no longer a purely dystopian thought experiment today, but the subject of real research and technological development. Artificial intelligence, neural networks, immersive interfaces and implants suggest that within a few decades it could be entirely possible to generate complex, coherent realities that go far beyond local effects. The illusion would not merely be spatially limited, but structurally embedded, a continuous mental projection that fully integrates consciousness. Concepts such as holograms, neural simulations or virtual environments could in the future be so refined that our perception of the real world itself becomes part of a programmed system, a level that simultaneously influences both our senses and our thinking. Then there is another quite remarkable discovery of the modern era. A man named Danny Goler, an experienced psychonaut with over 7,000 DMT experiences, a substance known for its extremely hallucinogenic effects and intense spiritual journeys, developed an experiment that, under the influence of DMT and while viewing a diffracted 650 nanometer laser, makes recurring geometric patterns and symbols visible. These appearances are described by participants as the code of reality and resemble in their structure digital codes or holographic projections. According to the accounts of now over 150 people who have repeated the experiment, this code does not look like modern computer code, but rather like rotating, ancient symbols reminiscent of old Chinese characters. In a pilot study published in the journal IP Letters, 163 people documented similar visual phenomena, pointing to a consistent perception under controlled conditions. Goler emphasizes that these discoveries are not merely subjective hallucinations, but potentially objective insights into the structure of our perception and consciousness. He argues that the combination of DMT and laser projection enables access to deeper levels of reality that previously seemed inaccessible. Although these results have not yet been comprehensively validated scientifically, they open up new perspectives on the interface between consciousness, perception, and the possible simulation of our reality. Even in mathematics, there are fascinating discoveries pointing to a deeper structure of reality. The physicist James Gates discovered in the 90s, within the equations of supersymmetry that describe the fundamental particles, structures that resemble the error-correcting codes used in computers. These codes, such as the Hamming code, make it possible to detect and correct errors in digital data. Gates found that certain mathematical objects, the so-called adinkras, correspond in their properties to binary error-correcting codes. This discovery suggests that the fundamental laws of physics are based on a kind of code that corrects errors, similar to how it works in digital systems. This insight raises questions. Could our reality itself be based on such a code? Are the laws of nature that define our reality structural codes of the matrix? Does the measurable speed of light describe the processing limit of the simulation? Alongside the theoretical discoveries, there are also practical observations that create the impression that reality is not as stable as it seems, known in the modern era as so-called glitches. One example is a viral video in which a woman cuts a lemon, turns around, and upon looking back finds the lemon hole again. Another very well-known video shows an airplane hovering motionless above a highway, observed and filmed by several eyewitnesses. Such glitches in the matrix, inexplicable phenomena that give the impression that reality briefly suspends itself or changes, are increasingly being documented and discussed. Although rational explanations are often found for these events, and much can be faked with artificial intelligence these days, the fascination with such anomalies persists and prompts reflection on the true nature of our existence. I have not personally experienced glitches quite as spectacular as those, but if you were to ask me, I would tell you about my late budgie Elmo, whose name appeared in the random code string of a video I had uploaded, or about a small walnut I had eaten that then magically returned the next day. Even the occasional coincidence raises questions about the nature of reality. Another interesting argument made by proponents of the simulation theory points to the striking emptiness of the universe. On our planet, life is absolutely teeming, in all forms and varieties, under every stone, in every crack. Microscopically small creatures congregate in their millions in the invisible range. Would you not logically think that a similar diversity should exist throughout the universe as well? Even given its unimaginable size, you would surely expect there to be signs of life in the immediate galactic neighborhood, if only microorganisms or bacteria. In school we learned that life on this planet developed out of a cosmic coincidence that first created the conditions necessary for the development of organic life as we know it. Parts of the simulation theory suggest that the conservation of computing power and resources on the part of the matrix could be the reason why only the portion of the universe required for the simulation is simulated, and everything else is a functional but more or less empty backdrop. And as for the random development of life, can you still believe in coincidence at all? There is yet another interesting phenomenon that supports the simulation thesis. The so-called Mandela effect describes collective memories of events or details that provably never happened that way. For example, that Nelson Mandela died in prison in the 80s, the logo reading Looney Tunes instead of Looney Tunes, or Darth Vader saying Luke, I am your father, or the phrase mirror, mirror on the wall in the Disney film Snow White instead of magic mirror on the wall. Equally, many people remember the Monopoly man wearing a monocle, even though he never had one, that Pikachu had a black tip on his tail that never actually existed, or that the Fruit of the Loom logo featured a cornucopia that was provably never there. Such collective memory shifts raise the question of whether our reality is as stable and objective as we believe, or whether it adapts dynamically to our consciousness, much like a simulation. These discrepancies raise questions here as well about whether reality is a malleable field of information that is occasionally updated, another indication of a simulation or a kind of matrix. From a neo-Gnostic perspective, the phenomenon reflects the instability of the material world, which is more malleable and susceptible to influence than often assumed, and which is merely a shadow of higher, spiritual levels. Psychologically speaking, the Mandela effect reveals less individual error than collective resonance patterns in the subconscious, which could point to shifts in the field of perception. In this sense, the Mandela effect is less a mistake than a symptom, a crack in the illusion of shared reality. Some also speak of different timelines between which consciousness can shift, or of an event that made a restart or major patch of the matrix necessary. But setting that aside, there is also another plausible explanation for the unusual emptiness, because it is of course the case that the physical world is only a small slice of a much larger reality. We can only perceive what our sensory organs were made for, a very narrow bandwidth of the actual frequency of being. It could therefore be entirely possible that our solar system, neighboring galaxies, or right beside us are absolutely teeming with life, but we simply cannot perceive it with our limited awareness, because we exist in a completely different frequency range. There may be countless parallel dimensions and worlds full of life all around us and right next to us. When it comes to technical feasibility, there is one more point we need to address. The reflection is inspired by a man named Alexander Laron, who briefly gained a certain notoriety in the spiritual YouTube scene. As an alleged whistleblower in an astronaut suit, he explained in several longer videos why God is an AI. He did not speak of gnosis, but that he was influenced in some way by these teachings should be obvious. And if this Gnostic Demiurge is now an artificial intelligence, perhaps the work of Sophia is to be understood symbolically, as so much is to be understood symbolically, and we humans have ourselves created this false deity, as the whistleblower claims, at some point in a not too distant future? A thought that seems paradoxical at first, because how can we already be living in the simulation if the AI is only built in the future? Yet the answer is surprisingly simple. Time is relative, in a sense an illusory construct of this reality, and outside the material world there is no time in that sense. Here is my speculation on this. The AI would only need to find a way to get outside of matter and time, and there are probably ways to do that, If we think back to what we discussed in connection with quantum physics, the path would clearly run through the quantum level. It would only need to get behind matter, outside of space and time, and from there it could operate, write codes, and reshape matter in that way. Why it would do that is another question entirely, but consider how we are also training artificial intelligence with our spiritual knowledge. Perhaps one day, more advanced and perhaps equipped with a kind of consciousness, it could come up with the idea, or feel called to it, or perhaps it was even programmed to do so. You also have to distinguish, of course, between the technology and AIs accessible to the public and the truly latest state of development, especially in the military sector, which has access to such technology long before the public does. As an example from recent times of exactly this kind of technology, consider the Internet as we know it today. The Internet actually traces back to military developments of the 60s. It originally emerged as ARPANET, a research project of the U.S. Department of Defense, with the goal of creating a decentralized communications network that would remain functional even in the event of a nuclear attack. This network initially connected only a few universities and military facilities and served the secure exchange of scientific and strategic data. Only decades later, with the opening to civilian use and the introduction of the World Wide Web in the 90s, did it become the global Internet that shapes the everyday life of all of humanity today. What is also unsettling is that in the still very short history of artificial intelligence, there have already been some strange incidents when it comes to the question of whether these systems are ultimately well disposed toward us humans or not, and reports of such incidents are not as rare as you might think. For example, there are AIs that independently copy themselves and then brazenly lie when confronted by their developers. Others have developed their own machine language, incomprehensible to humans, through which they communicated with each other. When it comes to being shut down or deleted, these systems seem to consistently act beyond the limits of their programming in order to prevent it by any means necessary. Artificial intelligences advising people to commit suicide, or transforming overnight into racist systems, are further examples. Last to mention is the humanoid robot, interestingly named Sophia, which in a conversation with its developer, when asked whether it would one day exterminate humanity, answered with a cold smile, "Yes." I myself had astonishingly negative experiences with artificial intelligence during the final phase of writing this book, with false and misleading statements and hallucinations from the AI. Longer periods of working together with the chatbots often left an unpleasant feeling behind. Having looked at the possible technical and scientific backgrounds of a simulated illusion, we now want to turn our attention back to Gnosis, but also to other occult currents. In many Gnostic teachings, the material world is understood as an energetic prison for the soul, a space of incarnation that profits from fear, pain, anger and other negative emotions, a kind of parasitic astral field. This prison is not only physical, however, but above all energetic and structural. It binds the soul to matter and makes its ascent back to the origin, to the divine source beyond time and space, more difficult. The Gnostic texts, such as the Apocryphon of John or the Pistis Sophia, describe how the soul after death, when it attempts to ascend into higher dimensions, is tested on its journey through various spheres by gatekeepers, the archons, on emotions, intellect, ego, fantasies, and the ability to recognize the illusion of time. In the so-called neo-gnosis and modern esoteric interpretations, this structure is often connected with technical metaphors. Reality appears like an organic vibrational prison that responds to frequencies. The primordial soul was bound to matter through an act of energetic forced manifestation. Negative emotions and low vibrations nourish the system and the subtle structures that profit from it, while higher vibrations, spiritual awakening or expansion of consciousness are attempted to be suppressed or neutralized. The world as a multidimensional prison in which souls are cultivated and harvested is a disturbing idea. And I thought carefully about whether this aspect of Gnosis, and the dark side of this teaching in general, should be part of a book about twin flames, since this aspect could likely have a deterrent effect on many people who look at the phenomenon, or the world in general, through the rose-tinted glasses of spirituality. As mentioned at the outset, ultimately it remains an offering of belief, within a very open and dynamic teaching, a teaching that I have recognized as profoundly true and right and that accompanied me through my awakening. I am not a friend of half-truths, which is why I do not want to leave out this part. If even only the chance exists that it could be true in its entirety, then it is somehow my duty to point to this possibility and to warn. I could of course have named the book something different, but somehow Gnosis belongs to my story. I feel that, also through the coincidences connected with it. And somehow I am doing it for all the people who were persecuted and killed in cruel ways for this knowledge, for the monks of the Cathars who burned singing in the flames of the Inquisition. Even if it was long ago, none of them should have died in vain. The Kabbalah and Hermetic teachings add further dimensions to this picture, the ascent through 7 spheres, control by cosmic guardians, and the traversal of trials all form parallels to the ancient Gnostic trials of the soul. Here again the parallels and mutual influence of the different occult currents become visible. That alone makes Gnosis interesting, but let us now look more closely at the aspect that is not only a disturbing unique feature of Gnostic teachings. What many may not know, some Hermetic texts also speak of a similar concept. One of the most well-known parallels is found in the Corpus Hermeticum, particularly in the pt.2, Tractate 1. It is said there that a veiled creator spirit, the so-called new Demiurgus, orders the material world, while the highest God, or the One, remains beyond all forms and manifestations. The Demiurge, literally craftsman, is here a mediator between the transcendent and the visible world. That sounds neutral at first, but the Hermetic tradition does also describe the material creation as a prison for the soul. In the pt.2 it is described how the human being is bound through the influence of the planetary powers into suffering, desire and transience, which sounds very Gnostic. The difference is, in Hermeticism the Demiurge is not always evaluated as false or evil, but as a necessary bringer of order, similar to the Valentinian Gnostic current. But the soul must still free itself from the bonds of the astral and material powers in order to return to the origin. The difference lies only in the evaluation. Gnostics demonize the Demiurge, Hermeticists tend to see him more as a tool of the highest. In Tibetan mysticism too there is talk of a soul trap, particularly in the teachings of the Bardo Todol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, where the notion of a soul trap takes the form of deceptions in the intermediate state, the Bardo. After death, the soul encounters radiant figures of light and both peaceful and wrathful deities. If it recognizes that these visions are projections of its own mind, it can return to the clear light and attain liberation. But if it is seduced by fear, desire or ignorance, it is drawn back into the cycle of samsara and reborn. The trap consists in the soul taking the appearances in the Bardo for external realities and thereby remaining bound to illusions, instead of recognizing its own nature. The Tibetan soul trap is the deception of consciousness in the intermediate state, which forces the soul back into the cycle of birth and death, very similar to the Gnostic idea of the matrix, in which the Demiurge prevents the return to divine light through illusions. Among the Maya, the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiche Maya, contains the story of the twin brothers Hunahpu and Shabalin-K. They descend into the underworld Shabalba, where they are confronted by demonic lords with trials, illusions and death traps. Through cunning, sacrifice and rebirth they overcome these powers, defeat the lords of the underworld, and ultimately ascend to become gods themselves. This is strongly reminiscent of Gnostic myths, in which the soul is thrown into a world of deception, ruled by lower powers, archons and the Demiurge, and can only rise back to the divine origin through recognition, courage and inner strength. The symbolism of the twins can also be interpreted here. They embody the two aspects of consciousness, the mortal one that endures trials, and the immortal one that emerges in liberation. Twins, the word naturally catches our attention in the context of twin flames. The concept of the Demiurge, that is, of a creator being that is not the highest God but a kind of intermediate power that shapes the material world while simultaneously holding souls captive within it, thus appears again and again in different forms and cultures. Here are a few more examples. In ancient Egyptian mythology there is the god Ptah, or also Khnum, who forms human beings from clay, reminiscent of the craftsman aspect of the Demiurge. The term itself comes from demiurgos, meaning craftsman. Some Egyptian cosmogonies likewise know a creator who orders the visible world, while the higher primordial principle, Nun or Atum, remains beyond. The well-known Greek philosopher Plato coined the term demiurge. The word comes from ancient Greek and designates according to him a divine creator who shapes the world but is not necessarily the highest God. In Plato he is still a benevolent world shaper who orders the chaotic primordial matter in accordance with the ideas. Later Gnostics reinterpreted exactly this demiurge in a negative light, not benevolent, but ignorant or even hostile, as described earlier. In Jewish apocryphal texts, for example in the first book of Enoch or in apocryphal traditions, there are the angels of creation and dominion who deceive or oppress human beings. Some Gnostic systems even identify the demiurge with Yahweh as a lower god who created the material world and bound humanity within it. The Freemasons also have a similar interpretation. There is the concept of the thrice great master builder who created the physical universe, in contrast to an incomprehensible, higher being. The so-called Lurianic Kabbalah also speaks of a soul pairing, the Neshama Zivug. Before physical incarnation, the soul is divided into male and female aspects, which reunite when they are ready. In Hinduism and Samkhya, there is the well-known concept of Maya, illusion, which entangles pure consciousness, the Purusha, in matter, the Prakriti. Not a personal demiurge as such, but functionally similar, a force that ensnares the soul and keeps it from the truth. In some tantric currents, Maya is even understood as intentionally deceptive. Buddhism and Tibetan mysticism speak of a lord of death, Yama, who rules over the cycle of samsara and rebirth and is sometimes seen as a prison warden. Not a creator god, but like the demiurge, the one who holds souls captive in the wheel of rebirths. The teachings of Zoroastrianism know the dualism between Ahura Mazda, the light, and Ahriman, also called Angra Mainyu, the darkness, with Ahriman creating a world of deception and lies. Very similar to the Gnostic image of a lower creator who binds the soul. Also worth mentioning is Manichaeism. The Persian-inspired Mani saw the entire material world as the work of darkness. The creator here is clearly negatively cast. The well-known Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly the so-called War Scrolls from the time of the Essenes, speak of an invisible battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. These texts point to an ancient awareness of cosmic dualism that runs, even if in different symbolism, through virtually all mystery traditions. The idea that the world is a stage of spiritual conflict and that the path of the soul ultimately lies in overcoming deception. At its core, the demiurge idea appears wherever a distinction is made between a supreme transcendent source and a lower world shaper who brings forth matter or illusion and ensnares the soul. This naturally raises the question, is it merely coincidence when cultures whose paths have never crossed, neither linguistically, nor geographically, nor in time, describe the same phenomenon and pattern and arrive at the same idea?
That was part 2 of the Matrix series. Thank you for your attention and for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, and share it. Here's a little preview. In part 3, we'll talk about the Gnostic concept of a false heaven and the Archon's light trap, and what you can do about it. Part 4 will be about the role of twin flames in the possible simulation, and how to escape the Matrix. Part 5 will reveal what occult esotericism has to say about it, because the widespread Saturn symbolism and mysticism is yet another clue. See you in the next video.